Spring 1943. Skies over Bougainville. Japanese pilots, accustomed to dominating all opponents in the Pacific theater, initially dismissed the unfamiliar American aircraft as just another variant of the lumbering Hellcat. But the mistake was quickly repaid. Wreckage scattered, cockpit windows riddled with bullet holes, and surviving pilots brought back anxious reports. In closed-door meetings, a new name rang out, heavy and haunting: Corsair. The shriek of death. With its enormous engine and overwhelming firepower, it not only changed the course of the skies, but also shattered the firm belief in Japan's air strategy. It was incredible how the once derided machine would become a terror that would make an empire tremble. On the Bougainville radio in the spring of 1943, every word of conversation was tinged with anxiety. Japanese squadron officers, trained to recognize every enemy sighting, took careful notes whenever they encountered an unfamiliar green fighter, but still hastily attributed it to a familiar Grumman Hellcat. In the intelligence logs from Rabaul, the mistake was repeated. Reports described American F-6Fs with unusual speeds and a high-altitude straight-dive attack. Yet in the sky, experienced pilots felt a vague unease, as if they were facing an enemy that was not at all like the one reported. The first clue came not in the training manuals, but in the chaos of the fighting. A glimpse of the folded wing shape, reminiscent of a swallow but rough and fierce. In a note from a Haikotai pilot, it read, "The blue wings were curved. We thought it was a Hellcat, but the speed and ability to climb straight up were beyond anything we had ever known." From there, confusion began to spread as the number of encounters with this stranger increased. Accustomed to dealing with wildcats and Airacobras, the Japanese pilots were surprised to be attacked from an altitude they could not control. Reports poured in. The new American aircraft had dived quickly, fired a fierce volley of fire, and then disappeared before the enemy could counterattack. The crippled Zeros returned, their fuselages riddled with dozens of bullet holes, their cockpit windows cracked but not broken. The specter of an unknown enemy began to fill the sky. Self-sealing fuel tanks smothered the flames that would have consumed any Zero. The Bougainville Squadron's loss log contained a single dry line. One did not return. The pilot was silenced forever after his first communications. The retracted wing shape, once ridiculed as uncouth, now became a chilling sign of a danger the Japanese could no longer ignore. The Corsair appeared, and from then on, all preconceptions about American fighters were immediately turned upside down. With familiar thinking, Japanese engineers and pilots had always judged their opponents by their agility and weight, but in front of this strange frame, they could not find any familiar explanation. The folded wings, once ridiculed as clumsy and awkward, turned out to be evidence of a design purpose beyond all initial speculation. Technical documents declassified after the war revealed the true intentions. The standard Hamilton propeller, 13 feet long, coupled with a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, required more ground clearance than conventional landing gear could provide. To accommodate this, Vought engineers were forced to create a distinctive folding wing shape, one that dipped down and then snapped back up. It was this seemingly odd choice that allowed the Corsair to maintain power and speed without sacrificing drag or stability. On paper, the design seemed like a mere technical compromise. But in air combat, it was a breakthrough. The R2800 engine, with more than 2,000 horsepower, gave the Corsair acceleration and altitude that Japanese pilots had never encountered. In reports from the Kerr Naval Arsenal, the engine was considered beyond the reach of existing aircraft. However, speed only reflected a small part of its true power. Japanese gunners were amazed that their rounds ricocheted off only the armored seats and nearly 2-inch thick bulletproof glass on some Corsairs. Self-sealing fuel tanks allowed the plane to continue flying, whereas the same shot would have turned a Zero into a blaze in midair. Still, the early Corsairs weren't perfect. The crisscrossed cockpit, dubbed the bird cage, led American pilots to complain about limited visibility. In the eyes of Japanese experts, the Corsair's massive fuselage was initially seen as a sign of inflexibility, but accounts from pilots returning from the battle painted a different picture. They described the enemy as a flying hunk of steel, taking heavy fire and then returning fire with 0.50-inch machine guns. The details that had been ridiculed in the design analysis, from the excess armor to the cramped stance, ended up being the very things that made Japanese pilots wary of the curved-wing Corsair. By late 1944, the Japanese naval staff was faced with a hard truth. The Corsair, once dismissed as a cumbersome aircraft fit only for land combat, was now flying in formations from the decks of American aircraft carriers. The entire old assumption, repeated in intelligence reports and technical manuals, suddenly collapsed. The belief that the blue fighter with its curved wings could not land on ships was, after all, a dangerous illusion. But the diaries on American ships reveal a different reality. Thanks to a series of technical adjustments, from improved tailhooks to retrained deck procedures, the Corsair's accident rate quickly dropped to that of the Hellcat, which was renowned for its reliability. For Japanese staff, this was a blow to the core of strategic calculations. One document captured after the war admitted bluntly, "We believed that the blue fighter could not take off and land on an aircraft carrier." They had emerged from the sea, closing off all escape routes. Carrier-based Corsair squadrons extended the reach of the U.S. Navy, striking targets the Japanese had once believed safe from distance. Each appearance forced commanders to revise their defensive manuals. What had once been seen as a design oddity had become a symbol of American surprise and unpredictability. Fast, powerful, and able to appear anywhere the American fleet was anchored. Corsair pilots brought with them a fighting style completely foreign to Japanese doctrine. They did not get caught in a long dogfight but climbed high, then plummeted, using their weight and engine power to their absolute advantage. In that moment of dive, Zero or Oscar could only watch helplessly as their opponents passed them at speeds they could never match. The F4U could reach speeds of up to 446 miles per hour, making it nearly impossible for the Japanese fighters to keep up. Meanwhile, their airframes began to shake violently at just over 250 miles per hour, and their ability to control their roll disappeared just when the situation was at its most dangerous. It was at that moment that the Corsair's .650 caliber machine guns opened fire, with a roar and range far beyond anything their opponents could return fire with. The Japanese pilots who dove in headfirst only risked breaking the fuselage apart. Those who lingered above were immediately targeted for the next round of dives. In post-war technical reports kept at the Kure Arsenal, the Corsair was described as being able to maintain control even at extremely high speeds, an advantage that made its power-based tactics impossible to replicate with contemporary Japanese fighters. For the Japanese pilots, the truth became brutally clear. The curved-wing fighter set the tempo of the dogfight and almost always won. The first warning never came from radio or radar, but from the sky above. A piercing screech ripped through the clouds before the blue figure appeared. They called it not the sound of an engine, but the sound of fate. On the ground, the Japanese soldiers were forced to hold their breath, for the presence of the Corsair meant there was nowhere safe to hide. In the skies above Okinawa, combat patrols circled doggedly, the roar of their engines echoing across the island. Whenever the kamikaze formations tried to assemble for a desperate mission, the Corsairs swooped down from above, their speed and furious firepower wiping out the ranks before they could even stabilize. Those pilots who returned described the chaos as their formations broke apart, with everyone thinking only of survival. Communications were broken. Discipline was gone. Testimonies from ground troops in post-war interrogations painted a grim picture. Hearing the screech overhead, they would rush into their bunkers or foxholes, abandoning their positions and weapons. For U.S. Marines, the Corsair had a different meaning, a guardian angel in the air, as rockets and 0.50-inch rounds tore through enemy lines before their eyes. The psychological wound had not yet healed. In their reports, Japanese Air Force commanders described a sudden threat followed by a heavy silence. As the final months of 1944 approached, they were forced to face bitter calculations. Intelligence meetings, once filled with confidence, were now tinged with a dark and cautious message. In secret summaries, warnings gradually appeared to avoid direct confrontation with the blue, curved-wing fighters. Reports from the field noted that the Corsair was virtually immune to conventional fire, forcing commanders to quietly issue orders, concentrate on bombers, or retreat when encountering American fighters. One translation of an Allied document even clearly stated the instructions to Japanese pilots: engage only if absolute superiority is achieved. Do not cut the scissors, report immediately. The order never appeared in a formal document, but gradually trickled down through squadron meetings and word of mouth among the commanders. The tactical language had changed. Corsairs were no longer to be viewed casually, but to be viewed with caution, even awe. For many Japanese pilots, it was the first truly bitter acceptance in the skies that some battles were no longer worth abandoning. Post-war studies have carved a clear line in the Corsair's history. Navy and Marine Corps records show that Corsair pilots shot down more than 2,140 Japanese aircraft for the loss of only 189 in combat, a kill ratio of more than 11-to-1. No other Allied fighter in the Pacific theater could match that, and technical reports once ignored by Japanese leaders now serve as living proof of the need to adapt. Late war fighters like the Ki-84 and Shidenkai were clearly influenced by the formula the Corsair had proven: speed, firepower, and survivability over pure maneuverability. But they came too late to change the game. The legacy of the curved wing goes far beyond victories, as it forced the military to rewrite the understanding of air combat, laid the foundation for future aircraft, and is remembered for defeating the veteran Japanese Air Force. Japanese combat reports and technical notes, initially still dismissive, gradually changed their tone to dire warnings about the Corsair's speed, firepower, and armor. Documents from 1943 reflect the initial confusion, but later intelligence summaries easily identified the new enemy by its distinctive folding wings and called for different tactics to counter it. Captured memos show a marked shift from glorifying bravery to emphasizing evasiveness and survival. In the Pacific, the Corsair's presence signaled the end of Japan's air supremacy,